New Orleans, 1919. A city of shadows and sound. The nights here never truly sleep. Jazz spills from smoky clubs, laughter rolls down cobblestone streets, and the Mississippi hums like a restless heartbeat. But beneath the music, something darker stirs, something carrying an axe. The city is living in terror. Families bar their doors, men keep pistols within reach, and women whisper prayers before bed. Because in the dead of night, the Axeman may come, and when he comes, there will be no mercy. On March 14, 1919, a letter appears in the Times-Picayune. It is written in a voice that sounds both theatrical and terrifying, as if Lucifer himself were dictating through human hands. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. At 12:15, I shall pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I will spare those in whose homes a jazz band is playing. One thing is certain. Those who do not play jazz that night will get the axe. The city panics, and then something extraordinary happens. Jazz explodes from every home, every club, every street corner. Bands play on porches, families drag phonographs into their parlors, neighbors gather with fiddles, trumpets, pianos. A carnival of survival. That night, New Orleans becomes a living orchestra, its people praying that music itself can hold death at bay. And it works. The Axeman strikes no one. Whether out of whim, pride, or some twisted game, he keeps his promise. The city awakens the next morning, exhausted but alive. But who was he, this phantom with a taste for music and murder? Why did he choose his victims, mostly grocers and their families, cut down with axes in their own homes? And how could a killer, bold enough to taunt the press, simply vanish into history? This is not a folk tale, not a ghost story passed down in whispers. The Axeman of New Orleans was real. His crimes, documented in police records, etched into newspaper columns, left blood on the floorboards and fear in every heart. Over the course of a single year, from May 1918 to October 1919, he struck again and again. Families hacked apart in their beds, doors and walls chipped open with chisels. The killer, often using the victim's own axes, left carelessly in backyards or kitchens. Sometimes valuables were untouched. Sometimes groceries lay scattered. No clear motive. No pattern the police could pin down. The only constant was chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. No trial, no capture, no confession. Only rumors, suspects, and a lingering question. Was he a madman, a gangster, or something far more sinister? The legend has grown ever since, blurring the line between fact and folklore. The Axeman has been called a serial killer before the term existed, a demon in human form. Even a frustrated jazz lover who turned murder into a macabre stage play. What we do know is this. The Axeman carved his name into American true crime, not with words, but with a blade. He is remembered because he terrified an entire city, then vanished without a trace, leaving only blood, silence, and the memory of one night when jazz was more than music. It was survival. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. The terror of the Axeman began not with a whisper, but with a scream, and the wet thud of steel against flesh. On the night of May 23, 1918, the first bodies were discovered on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. The victims, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Italian grocers, well-liked in the community, living in a small apartment above their store. In the dark hours before dawn, someone slipped inside their bedroom. The intruder's first act was swift, efficient, and terrifying. He cut their throats with a straight razor while they slept. Catherine's wound was so deep her head was nearly severed. But the killer didn't stop there. He swung an axe, striking both Joseph and Catherine again, as if determined to leave no chance of survival. And yet, Joseph clung to life. When his brothers, Jake and Andrew, came to check on him, they found him staggering, covered in blood, moments from death. Catherine lay lifeless beside him. On the pavement outside, the killer had left a message. "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." What did it mean? Some thought it referred to an earlier attack on Anthony and Joanna Sciambra in 1912. Police puzzled over the taunt, but no clear link emerged. Inside, they found something even stranger. The killer had changed out of his bloody clothes and left them neatly behind. He walked away in a fresh set of clothes, unhurried, unfazed. Money and valuables lay untouched. This wasn't robbery. Investigators discovered the razor belonged to Joseph's brother Andrew, who ran a barber shop nearby. That discovery, coupled with Andrew's own admission that he'd been drunk that night and heard nothing but groaning, made him the prime suspect. But after questioning, the case against him crumbled. The real killer was still free, and New Orleans was only beginning to bleed. On June 27, 1918, just a month later, another grocer, Louis Bessemer, and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were brutally assaulted inside their shop at Dorgenois and La Harpe. This time, the weapon was Louis's own hatchet. Harriet was struck near her ear, leaving her face paralyzed. Louis took a devastating blow to the temple that fractured his skull. Yet once again, both victims survived. Barely. They were discovered by a delivery driver, John Zanka, who arrived to drop off bread. He found them barely conscious, soaked in blood. Suspicion fell quickly, and in the ugliest way possible. Police arrested Louis Ubacan, a black employee who had recently worked for Bessemer, despite having no real evidence. The public barely blinked. It was easier, in 1918 New Orleans, to blame a black laborer than to admit there might be a phantom killer on the loose. Ubacan was eventually released, his innocence clear. Then Harriet Lowe, from her hospital bed, became a kind of tragic sideshow. Her statements shifted wildly. She accused Bessemer himself of being her attacker. She accused him of being a German spy because foreign language letters were found in his possession. Police arrested him too, but the case fell apart. Harriet lingered, her health failing. In August, before she died during surgery, she named Bessemer again as her attacker. He was charged with murder, spent 9 months in jail, and was acquitted after the jury deliberated less than 10 minutes. The truth was slipping away, and the Axeman was still moving in the shadows. On August 5, 1918, a young woman named Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, awoke in the middle of the night to a figure looming over her bed. Before she could scream, he brought down a lamp from the bedside table, smashing it into her face again and again. Her husband found her when he returned late from work. Her scalp was split open, her face mangled with cuts, but she lived. 2 days later, she delivered a healthy baby girl. This time, the police arrested James Gleason, a known ex-convict, but no evidence tied him to the crime, and he was released. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Each attack brutal, intimate, but devoid of robbery. Money and valuables were always left untouched. And still, the city's leaders reassured the public that these were isolated crimes. Just 5 days later, the phantom struck again. On August 10, 1918, sisters Pauline and Mary Bruno awoke to the sounds of chaos in their uncle Joseph Romano's room. Rushing in, they found the elderly grocer staggering, blood gushing from his head. Romano had been struck with an axe, twice, leaving deep, fatal gashes. The sisters saw a shadow fleeing into the night, a heavy-set man, dark-skinned, wearing a slouched hat. It was the first time anyone had gotten even a partial look at the Axeman. Romano clung to life long enough to walk to the ambulance, but he died 2 days later. Police found a bloody axe in his yard and a door panel chiseled away. This killing lit the city on fire. Fear spread through New Orleans like never before. Families reported strange men lurking in alleys. Citizens called in finding axes left in their backyards. Panic bred paranoia. The name Axeman was now etched into newspaper headlines and into the city's nightmares. But the most shocking crime came months later, on March 10, 1919, across the river in Gretna, Louisiana. The Cortimiglia family, Charles, his wife Rosie, and their infant daughter Mary, were attacked in their small home. A neighbor, grocer Orlando Giordano, rushed over after hearing screams and found the door broken. Inside, he discovered devastation. Charles had a fractured skull. Rosie's head was split open. Baby Mary lay dead in her mother's arms, killed by a single blow to the neck. Again, the back door had been chiseled open. Again, valuables were untouched. But this case took a strange turn. When Rosie regained consciousness, she accused her neighbor Giordano and his teenage son Frank of committing the murders. There was no logic to it. Giordano was elderly and frail, his son far too large to fit through the door's cutout panel. Charles denied his wife's claims, but police went forward anyway. Both men were convicted, Frank sentenced to hang, his father to life in prison. The city saw justice served, but almost a year later, Rosie recanted. She admitted she had lied, driven by jealousy and spite. The Giordanos were released, their lives ruined. The Axeman had claimed another victim, not with his axe, but with the hysteria he left behind. By now, the city could no longer deny it. There was a phantom haunting New Orleans. The pattern was chilling. Entry through a chiseled door panel. Victims attacked with their own axes or razors. Money and valuables left untouched. Targets disproportionately Italian grocers or their families. The Axeman seemed to strike at random, yet with eerie consistency. He attacked men, women, even children, but spared valuables. The brutality was personal, almost ritualistic, and the victims, often Italian immigrants, suggested a sinister motive. Was this a madman, or someone with a grudge against the immigrant community? The press fanned the flames, branding him with a name that would never be forgotten: the Axeman of New Orleans. And as fear spread, so did speculation. Was this a burglar turned killer? A lunatic with a taste for blood? Or, as some whispered, a supernatural force, a demon cloaked in human form, who stalked the streets with axe in hand? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the Axeman wasn't finished, and the city's nightmare was only beginning. By the autumn of 1918, New Orleans was a city divided against itself. By day, life went on as usual: jazz spilling out of dance halls, the clatter of streetcars, vendors hawking fruit and oysters in the humid air. But by night, the mood shifted. Doors that once stood open in the thick Louisiana heat were bolted shut. Windows were barred, shutters nailed down. The carefree rhythm of the Crescent City dulled into a nervous silence. The murders weren't happening every week, but they happened just often enough to keep the fear alive. And everyone whispered the same name: the Axeman. The press leaned into the terror, printing every gory detail, running sketches of bloody hatchets and lurid headlines that sold papers as fast as they could print them. Each new attack was reported like an approaching storm, and readers devoured every column, looking for patterns, explanations, anything that might make sense of the horror stalking their streets. Italian-American grocers especially felt a weight pressing down on them. Many of the Axeman's earliest victims had been Italian immigrants or their families, small shopkeepers scraping together a life in a city where prejudice against Italians still ran deep. Whispers spread that this wasn't random, that the killer held a grudge against their community, or that it was a vendetta rooted in the tangled world of local business rivalries. But others saw it differently. If the killer had a motive, why leave valuables untouched? Why slip in and out of homes without taking a dime? And why use the victim's own axes, blades, and tools, always at hand in kitchens and sheds, instead of bringing his own weapons? The police were no closer to answers. Each crime scene told the same story: a back door or window chiseled open, an axe pulled from the victim's own house, bodies struck down in their beds. Yet fingerprints were unknown, witnesses scarce, and the killers seemed to vanish into the night like smoke. Detectives chased false leads, suspicious neighbors, ex-convicts, even the family members of victims. But every trail ran cold. Frustration grew. How do you stop a murderer who leaves no trace, who seems to appear and disappear at will? Some officers muttered that they weren't dealing with a man at all, but with something darker, something almost supernatural. Ordinary families began to change the way they lived. Fear reshaped the city. In Italian neighborhoods, entire households slept together in one room, doors barricaded, axes or pistols clutched close at hand. Neighbors watched each other's windows, scanning for movement in the shadows. Children were hushed indoors at dusk, and even the brash young men of the quarter hesitated before venturing out at night. Still, the Axeman struck again and again. Each blow reminded the people of New Orleans that no lock could hold him, no street was too busy, no victim too ordinary. And with every unsolved killing, the legend grew. By the spring of 1919, the fear had hardened into something else: obsession. Who was he? A madman? A burglar with a twisted streak? Or someone hiding in plain sight? A neighbor, a grocer, a friend? The city demanded answers, but the Axeman had only just begun. By March of 1919, New Orleans was a city stretched thin by terror. Each fresh attack had sharpened the fear, each unsolved case deepened the mystery. But no one was prepared for what arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune on March 13th. It was a letter, 3 pages long, written in a fevered hand, signed not with a name but with a persona: the Axeman. Its words burned with menace. They have never caught me, and they never will. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. The writer mocked the city's fear, taunted the police, and promised to kill again. But there was something else, something strange, theatrical, almost absurd. The letter declared that on the following Tuesday night, the Axeman would pass over New Orleans. Any home or business where jazz was not being played would be marked for death. The message was chilling and bizarre all at once. Play jazz and live. Stay silent and die. The city went into a frenzy. That Tuesday night, New Orleans erupted in sound. Every jazz hall in town was packed shoulder to shoulder. Musicians struck up frantic tunes, blowing horns and pounding pianos as if life itself depended on it. Families dragged their gramophones to the porch, the scratchy voices of Louis Armstrong's contemporaries spilling into the humid air. Bands set up on street corners, on balconies, in backyards. Children clapped, neighbors sang, and the music of survival echoed through every street and alley. The city that invented jazz became, for one night, a fortress of sound. And the Axeman? He kept his word. Not a single person was killed that night. No dark figure slipped through a window. No hatchet fell in the shadows. Instead, the city danced on the edge of terror, transformed into something between a carnival and a seance. For a few hours, the fear gave way to a strange exhilaration. They had obeyed the demon's command, and lived. The press seized the moment. The Axeman, they wrote, had become something larger than a killer. He was now a legend, a phantom who straddled the line between crime and folklore, between man and monster. But beneath the laughter, the music, the absurdity of it all, the fear only deepened. Who could write such a letter? Was it truly the killer, mocking the city in its own newspaper? Or some hoaxer, seizing on the hysteria for attention? The police had no answers. What they did know was that the murders would not stop. Jazz had saved the city for one night, but it would not save them forever. The letter left New Orleans changed. It was no longer just about unsolved murders or a mysterious figure breaking into homes. It was about something bigger. A city gripped by the idea that a killer could dictate how they lived. what they listened to, even how they celebrated their own culture. The Axeman had fused himself to the heartbeat of New Orleans. His legend became inseparable from the very thing that made the city famous: jazz. And so, half demon, half showman, the Axeman stepped out of the shadows and into myth, forever tied to the night New Orleans played for its life. By the late summer of 1919, New Orleans was tired. The city had lived through over a year of night terrors: grocers butchered in their beds, families shattered, jazz records spinning to ward off death. The Axeman had become less of a man and more of a specter, haunting the city's imagination. And yet, the killings were not done. On August 10, 1919, another grocer fell into the phantom's path. Steve Bocca, like many of the Axeman's victims, was an Italian immigrant who had carved out a modest life running a neighborhood store. That night, as he slept, he awoke to the sensation of being watched. In the dim shadows of his bedroom, a figure loomed over him. Before Bocca could cry out, the axe came down. Somehow, Bocca survived. Staggering, dazed, blood streaming from a wound to his skull, he managed to escape his home and stumble into the street. He collapsed at the door of his neighbor, Frank Januza. By the time help arrived, Bocca was barely conscious. Police found the familiar signs: a back door chiseled open, an axe left behind, and no valuables missing. Once again, the violence was senseless, motiveless, almost ritualistic. Bocca recovered in the hospital, but his memory of that night never returned. He couldn't describe his attacker. He couldn't even recall the moment the axe struck. All that was left was silence, and the growing fear that the Axeman's reign was far from over. Just weeks later, on September 3rd, the killer struck again. This time, it wasn't a grocer. It wasn't even an Italian immigrant. 19-year-old Sarah Lauman, a young woman living alone in her New Orleans apartment, was found unconscious by her neighbors after she failed to answer their knocks. Breaking into her room, they discovered her battered body. Her teeth had been knocked loose, her head bloodied, her face savaged by a blunt weapon. On the lawn outside, police found the weapon, a bloody axe. Unlike many before her, Sarah survived. But like Bocca, she remembered nothing. The night was a blank. Her injuries told the story, but her mind was silent. And so, the mystery deepened. Was the Axeman's choice of victim expanding? Was the pattern breaking down? Or were these attacks the work of a copycat, emboldened by the legend already gripping the city? The final act of terror came on October 27, 1919. That night, Mike Pepitone, another grocer, lay in bed while his wife tended to their 6 children. She was awakened by a crash, a commotion. Rushing to her husband's room, she arrived just in time to see a hulking figure with an axe slip out into the night. What she found inside was carnage. Blood covered the room, splattered on the walls, streaked across the sheets. Even the painting of the Virgin Mary above the bed was soaked red. Mike Pepitone had been struck down violently, his head split open. His wife, paralyzed by shock, could only describe the killer as large. Beyond that, nothing. The Pepitone murder was brutal, even by the Axeman's standards, and it was final. After that night, the killings stopped, abruptly, mysteriously, as though the figure who had terrorized New Orleans had vanished into thin air. By the fall of 1919, New Orleans no longer woke to the sound of axes splintering doors. No more grocers collapsed in bloodied heaps. No more families huddled together, clutching pistols and kitchen knives in the dark. The Axeman was gone. But where did he go? Some say he simply left town, drifting north or west, continuing his bloody work under another name. Others believe the story of Frank "Doc" Mumphrey, that his death in Los Angeles 2 years later brought an end to the nightmare. Shot by the widow of Mike Pepitone, Mumphrey's violent demise seemed almost poetic, as though vengeance had finally caught up with the Axeman. And yet, there is no proof, no evidence, no confession. The case files of the New Orleans police grew cold, and the Axeman faded into rumor, legend, myth. He had arrived without warning, slaughtered with no logic, taunted an entire city with a jazz-fueled letter, and then disappeared as suddenly as he came. What lingers, more than the names of suspects or the theories of motive, is the atmosphere. The feeling of living in a city where a faceless man could strike at any time, where an unlocked window, a thin door, or a quiet night could be shattered by the swing of an axe. For those who lived through it, the Axeman was not just a criminal. He was a phantom, stitched into the fabric of New Orleans itself. And though his killings ended over a century ago, the story of the Axeman endures, because he was never caught, never unmasked, never explained. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. When the murders finally stopped in 1919, the relief in New Orleans was immediate, but it left behind a gnawing question. Who was the Axeman? Police files never delivered a definitive answer, but one name kept resurfacing in whispers across the city. Frank Doc Mumphrey. Mumphrey was a shadowy figure, a con man, a petty criminal. Some claimed he dabbled in the occult. Others said he had ties to the Mafia. He drifted through the neighborhoods of New Orleans under different names, sometimes Leon Joseph Mumphrey, sometimes Manfrey, leaving behind stories of extortion and scams. And there was something else. Mumphrey had once run a struggling music business in the Garden District. After the Axeman's infamous letter threatened that only jazz could spare lives, his fortunes seemed to turn. Clubs hired musicians, record shops couldn't keep gramophones in stock, and suddenly, Mumphrey's business was thriving. To some, it was too convenient. Had the Axeman not only killed with an axe, but also with terror, and lined his pockets in the process? But the theory has holes. When Mumphrey was finally shot to death in Los Angeles in 1921 by the widow of a former lover, there was no conclusive evidence tying him to the murders in New Orleans. He was a criminal, yes. But was he the criminal? Or simply an opportunist who profited off panic? Other theories swirled like the humid air above the Mississippi. Some insisted it was Mafia revenge. Many of the victims were Italian grocers, and the killings bore a grim resemblance to warnings and punishments handed down by organized crime. But the brutality was far too theatrical, and the lack of theft too puzzling for most investigators to believe it was mob business. Others pointed to racial tension. This was a city deeply divided, and some attacks targeted African American families or employees. Was the Axeman's terror a way of stoking division? Or just a reflection of New Orleans' fractured society, with random victims caught in the cracks? Then there was the simplest explanation, and in some ways the most frightening, that the Axeman was a lone madman, a drifter, a figure with no connection to victims, no consistent motive, no plan beyond the bloodlust. That would explain the chaos, the randomness, the sheer cruelty of attacks where valuables were left untouched, groceries scattered, and families ruined for no reason at all. The truth is, the patterns are bewildering. Sometimes money was stolen. Sometimes it was left in plain sight. Sometimes the victims were grocers, often Italian immigrants, but not always. Some were attacked with their own axes, some with razors, some with household objects. No consistent motive, no clear thread, except perhaps one. The only lasting mark of identity left by the Axeman was the letter about jazz. Whether authentic or hoax, it forever tied his legend to the music of the city. It made him more than a killer. It made him an omen, a phantom who controlled a city not just with violence, but with art. And so the suspects remain, even today. A con man, a mob hit, a racist agitator, a lunatic with no plan. Or maybe all of them were wrong, and the Axeman was never one man at all, but a name given to chaos itself, stalking the streets of New Orleans. The Axeman may have vanished in 1919, but his shadow never left New Orleans. In fact, It grew. Within months of his final attack, his name had slipped into song. The mysterious Axeman's Jazz was composed and recorded, a playful yet macabre tune that immortalized the night the city filled its streets with music to appease a killer. Even in terror, New Orleans found rhythm. Even in blood, it found jazz. Over the decades, the Axeman's story hardened into folklore. He became a ghost tale whispered in the French Quarter, a piece of true crime lore mentioned in the same breath as Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. Criminals who were never caught, never named, and thus never forgotten. Writers and historians pored over police files, while novelists and screenwriters reimagined him as something darker, stranger, even supernatural. In pop culture, he's appeared in books, podcasts, and TV shows, most famously in American Horror Story, Coven, where the Axeman of New Orleans was resurrected as a spectral figure stalking the modern city. But why does this particular case endure? Why does the Axeman still matter more than a century later? Perhaps it's because he wrote to the press. His chilling letter, equal parts boast and performance, gave the killer a voice, a personality that invited fascination as much as fear. Few murderers ever seize the stage so theatrically. Perhaps it's because of that singular night in March 1919, when a city under siege turned its fear into celebration. Jazz bands on porches, families spinning gramophones at midnight, the streets alive with music instead of screams. It was as though New Orleans, in defiance of death, chose to dance. And perhaps it's because we remain captivated by the unsolved. The Axeman, like the Ripper and Zodiac, belongs to that unsettling fraternity of killers who vanish without consequence. No arrest, no trial, just questions echoing across the decades. In the end, the Axeman is not only a story of crime, but of culture. A killer who became a character, a myth stitched into the fabric of New Orleans itself. Part terror, part carnival. A century later, we still don't know who he was. And then, nothing. After October 1919, the Axeman of New Orleans simply disappeared. No more letters, no more bodies, just silence. A city that had lived in fear for 18 long months woke one day to find the nightmare gone. Did he die? Did he flee? Or had the Axeman always been less a man than a story, an invention of terror that slipped away once the city no longer needed him? That's the haunting paradox. The Axeman left almost no evidence behind. No arrest, no photographs, no name etched into court records. Yet he lives on in songs, in novels, in the whispers of French Quarter ghost tours. He is both real and unreal, a shadow that walked away into history, leaving only echoes. So who was he? A lone madman with a taste for jazz and blood? A vengeful spirit of the city's restless streets? A myth born from fear, given shape by the press and sustained by the people? Maybe that's why we're still talking about him more than a century later. Not just because of the killings, brutal as they were, but because of the surreal theater he forced New Orleans to play out. That single night when music filled the city, and everyone, from the richest families to the poorest laborers, kept jazz alive to ward off death. The crimes made him infamous. The music made him immortal. So I leave you with this question. Do we remember the Axeman because of the blood he spilled, or because of the music he left behind?